Okay, welcome everyone. So we're on our eighth session. So we're almost at the midway point in our Jewish literacy class. And this is on Mishnah and Talmud. And I would say there are many things which I found utterly surprising, if not shocking, about Judaism as I studied it as an adult and got deeper into it. But probably the most surprising has to do with Mishnah and Talmud. And that is that Judaism, as it's been practiced for the last 1900 years or so, is really not the religion of what most people call the Old Testament, of what I prefer to call the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible. Judaism is the religion of the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud. And of course, it begins with the Hebrew Bible, but as we saw in, I think, the second session, the Hebrew Bible gives birth to two religions, Judaism and Christianity. And each one is reading the Hebrew Bible through a different interpretive lens and also a different language. So, Christian reading of Hebrew Bible is largely in Greek translation, in the early days of Christianity. And of course, Judaism is in Hebrew. But almost everything we do as Jews, while it may have a seed in the Hebrew Bible, really has its expression in the Talmud. And I would say virtually no non-Jews understand this, or a very tiny fraction. And I would also hazard a guess that unless you've studied Judaism as an adult, you also are unaware of this. I remember teaching this class years and years ago, and one student being angry to find out about it. And she had gone through, bat mitzvah and bat mitzvah training and confirmation, and then, stopped studying Judaism and thought of herself as a pretty knowledgeable Jew, but she had no clue on this. And so it's a point to emphasize. So again, just now looking at some slides. If the Bible is the heart of Judaism, the Talmud is its bloodstream. I'm sure I got that from somewhere, but I don't remember where. As you will see, the Talmud is a combination of two texts. One is called the Mishnah, and the second is called the Gemara, and I'll explain that in great detail shortly. There are two Talmuds, the Yerushalmi, which is often called the Jerusalem or the Palestinian Talmud, is completed about the year 400 of the Common Era, and the Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud, completed maybe 100 years later. And although you might think the Jerusalem Talmud would be more authoritative, the Bavli is far more authoritative, of 6 times the size, as it says here. And the reason is what was going on. The Bavli, as its name suggests, is being put together in the land known as Babylon. Although by the time the rabbis are there, it is not. The Babylonian Empire has disappeared. The land is basically Persia, with modern day Iran. But the Jews are pretty much welcome and treated very well in that part of the world. On the other hand, back in the Holy Land, in the early days of the Talmud, the Jews are being harassed by the Romans. And then in the 4th century, Rome becomes Christian, and the Jews are being harassed by the Christians. So there's not an easy, it's not an easy time in the Holy Land for rabbis to get together to study these texts. And so when people refer to the Talmud, unless there's a particular statement that we're referring to the Jerusalem Talmud, you can always assume that it's the Babylonian Talmud. The completed Talmud includes mentions and citations from more than 1,000 rabbis and teachers. The rabbis whose views are recorded in the Mishnah, and as you'll see, the Mishnah is an earlier text, pulled together probably between 200 BCE and written down in 200 CE. The rabbis that are in that text are called Tanaim, which is an Aramaic word for teachers. And the rabbis who are quoted in the much larger Gemara are called Amoraim. Amar means to speak, so their name refers to explainers or interpreters. Not important for you really to remember this stuff. So this is a slide you've seen before, and it's a simple one. I'm going to show you a slightly more complicated one in the next slide of Jewish sacred text beyond the Hebrew Bible. Again, I would say most Jews I run into would think that the Jewish sacred literature is the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. And of course, that is far from true. So we have the books of the Bible, and they are pretty much the same books. We talked about this in great detail last week as the Protestant Old Testament in a different order. And then we have another box called the Talmud here. And here is our sacred myth, and we're sticking to it. Our sacred myth is that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, Moses received two revelations. One was the written Torah, which of course is called the 5 books of Moses. And the second was an oral Torah, which came with the instructions, never ever write it down. And we talked about this, I think, in our second session on Torah. There are some advantages and disadvantages to never writing a text down. So the tradition is that Moses taught it to his disciples, and they taught it to their disciples, and never wrote it down. And as you will see, it's not a small text, the oral law. In fact, it's a huge set of material. And people were just geniuses at memory in those days. You know, once we invented writing, and particularly the printing press, all that stuff behind me, I don't have to memorize anymore. I just need to know where to look for it. And, you know, that's technology, which for the last 30 years, I don't even need that. This is all I need. All I need is my trusty web browser and Google, and I can find out all kinds of information. So the need for memory is, at least for me, fortuitously growing more distant as my memory grows less and less reliable. But back in the old days, particularly if you had a tradition where you were not to write this down, there were people who were reciters. So imagine a group of rabbis, and they want to discuss a Mishnah called Pesachim, dealing with Pesach, but they don't have any written text. So they call on one guy in the third row and they say, you know, go to the 10th chapter of Pesachim, the 4th Mishnah, and chant it. And the guy would stand up and say, anybody recognize that Mishnah? Yeah, it's the 4 questions. It's the first of the 4 questions that's in the Mishnah. And you chant it to melody because you can remember melodies. I bet almost every one of you can complete this sentence. It's an ancient sacred text. It was an itsy bitsy teeny weeny
yellow polka dot bikini.
Why do we remember that? Of all the useless texts, it's catchy and it goes to a melody, and that's why we chant Torah and Haftorah, and there's Gregorian chants and all kinds of things. So that's the way these texts were studied. In the year 200 of the Common Era, the leading rabbi of the time, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the word Hanassi means prince, is worried. What is he worried about? There have been 2 unsuccessful revolts against Rome, and the schools of study, particularly in the Holy Land, are being disbanded and broken up. And so he's worried that, you know, if you have just one generation where these texts are not remembered, they are gone. So he takes upon himself the task of writing down what he thought was the most. I think I'm gonna mute everyone.
I went through an old.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. So he took upon himself the task of writing down what he thought was the most significant parts of the oral law. Based on an analysis, we can tell he wrote about 1/6 of it down. That work becomes the Mishnah, comes from the same root of the word shana, which is year. A year is something that repeats and repeats. Mishnah is a repetition of what is the oral law. And then for the next few hundred years, the rabbis of many generations, we're talking hundreds of years here, study the Mishnah and talk about it. And at the end of this period, a redaction occurs, namely somebody pulls together text of this discussion. And the Mishnah plus the Gemara equals the Talmud. But wait, there's more. So this is what we've just talked about. If I can, now I can't enlarge it from here. Oh, that's a shame. Maybe I can. Let's see how this works. Oh, look at this. Wow. Oh, that's very cool. Now let's see if I can. Oh, this is great. I never knew I could do this. So here's the Mishnah. That's just what we saw. I assume everybody sees the enlarged version. Yes. Okay, good. I'm getting excited here by myself. So it's not the end of the situation, because as you will see, there are great commentators and not so great commentators talking about the Mishnah and the Gemara, talking about the Talmud. So you have Rashi and many other people. You'll see that in a moment. And then Jewish law is scattered in this text. And the text, for anyone who studied with us on Saturday mornings, 8 o'clock Pacific time, Saturday morning, we have a Talmud study group. You can see that it's kind of stream of consciousness. And remember, there's no printing press at this time. So if you're a scholar in this period and you have all the material, you have just a pile of scrolls, and it's not a small pile of scrolls. And somebody comes in and asks a question, let's say about, I don't know, Hanukkah lamps. Unless you know where to look, you can't answer the question. So we'll see this as we discuss Jewish law, but we're going to see a number of people will come up with an analysis, basically a logical review of the material with the laws in mind. And probably not probably, but a very significant one is the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides. I can't tell you how long it took me to realize that this Mishnah Torah is not the same as the Mishnah. They are not the same. And then a very important law book is the Shulchan Aruch, which is the first Jewish code of law created after the invention of the printing press. And then people ask questions. We'll talk about more of this when we get into Jewish law, but also kind of on the side, developing around the same period are midrash stories the rabbis come up with. And we're going to talk about that, I think, next week, or not next week, no class next week. I'll try and remind you of that later. So that's midrash. And over here, there's a mystical commentary on Torah called the Zohar. We'll talk about that when we talk about mysticism. And then there's also a discussion of the Siddur, how you pray. I'm going to see if I can get back. Oh, look at that. Okay, great. Thank you. Jane.
I'm just wondering, in looking at your diagram, you got the 11th century, the 12th, the 16th, and then it's 6 to the 20th, responsa. I mean, is there anyone that stands out that in the same way that the Mishnah in 200 CE, or the Gemara in 400 CE, or the Babylon?
Yeah.
They were, I don't know if I'd say individuals, but I mean, they were definite.
So the question, again, it really depends specifically what you're asking. And I think what you're asking is, are there any specific texts that have the same level of importance as the ones I've quoted? Is that a good way?
Well, yeah, but in other words, I guess, I mean, who knows? But in 100 years, would we see, oh, and this is from the 21st century, or this is definitely from the 20th century, as opposed to 400
Yeah,
BC.
so I
Yeah.
would say, there are, it's a very interesting question. If you go back a few hundred years, only 300 years,
Yeah.
though, you have the central text of Chabad, which now it's just that's my memory. Someone
Joseph Caro.
No. That's the Shulchan Aruch. There's the Tanya. So the founding Rebbe of Chabad, a branch of Hasidism, wrote a book called the Tanya, which comes from the same word as the Tanaim, teacher. And I would say to Chabad that has as much significance as any of these texts. It's a very interesting question. Will in the future, for example, a book like When Bad Things Happen to Good People hold the same level of significance for Jews as some of these texts? I don't know. It's a very interesting question. Never thought about it. And then, of course, people continue to write commentaries. So there's a woman's commentary on the Torah, published by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So there's it takes a very different take on many of the elements of Torah. So the process of interpreting and commenting certainly doesn't end. It's a very good question. Okay, I want to talk a little more about Mishnah, and you can lower your hand, Jane, or I can help you with that. Mishnah, as I mentioned, is from the word shana, to repeat, therefore to study by repetition, study by going over material again and again. It is the recorded oral law, as we'll see, because the Torah didn't answer all legal and religious questions. And I'll actually look at this one in a little more detail. For example, it says you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And in fact, it's punishable by death. It's a capital crime to work on the Sabbath. But the Bible and the Torah doesn't give you a detailed description of what work is. So therefore, you would think somewhere there would be a description, and sure enough, there is, and it's in the Mishnah. And oral law is also helpful and required to maintain relationships with teachers. And this was deemed the best way to pass down Jewish tradition. Remember, this is a time when written texts are not plentiful. I always find it powerful to remember that before Gutenberg, which is 1400s, if you owned a book, it meant somebody physically copied that book. So there weren't a lot of books around. It's compiled, I mentioned, by Yehuda HaNasi, and he is so famous that in the Talmud, when they refer to someone as rabbi, this is the guy they mean. So he is the central rabbi in the Talmudic tradition. And I mentioned that he feared that the works would be lost if not written down. But I also mentioned that he only picked about 1/6 of the total law. And you will often, as you study Talmud, you will hear, a quote that says, this, Rabbi Natan said. And so these are elements of the oral law, and they're easy to pick out actually when you're studying because they're in Hebrew. Most of the rest of the Gemara is in Aramaic. So it's easy to pick out the Baraitas. And it's a huge corpus of material. I mentioned Mishnah is written in Hebrew, but the Hebrew is different from that of the Bible. So not surprisingly, the English that we speak is very different from Chaucerian English. It's different from Shakespearean English. It's different from the English you find, in the Declaration of Independence. Language changes over time, and that's absolutely true with Hebrew. And there's markers, you might say in English, you would see words like thee and thou rather than you. And that would let you kind of tie the English down to a certain period of time. We see exactly the same thing in Hebrew. So there's biblical Hebrew, there is Mishnaic Hebrew, sometimes called rabbinic Hebrew. There's the Hebrew of the later commentators, where Aramaicisms start creeping in. And of course, there's Aramaic, and then there's modern Hebrew, which develops because we need new words. There's no word in Jewish tradition for banana. So the Hebrew word for banana is banana, just in case you ever want one when you're on the streets of Jerusalem. The Mishnayot are short, elegant, and idealistic compared to the Gemara. So one of my teachers, I'm sure this is Judith Abrams, would say the Mishnah corresponds to the Constitution by analogy, elegant and general, but leaving a lot of things open. So, perfect example is the Constitution says, the right to bear arms shall not be abridged. Military being necessary, we have the right to bear arms. So what exactly does that mean? It says Congress will make no law establishing a particular religion. What exactly does that mean? That gets resolved in Supreme Court decisions and legalistic decisions of other courts, and maybe even later clarifying law. And so it is with what we're studying. The Mishnah is pretty compact and general, and then how things get resolved is very much in the Talmud. Just some structural things to give you an idea. The Mishnah is divided into 6 main categories or orders, and each order is divided in tractates. There are 63 tractates in all, and each tractate has several chapters, and the chapters contain lots of individual verses. Each verse is called a Mishnah, in plural Mishnayot. So a typical reference to a verse of Mishnah might say Sanhedrin 3:4, referring to the 4th Mishnah in the 3rd chapter of the tractate Sanhedrin. And typically you don't see references back to the order. And in a minute, we'll read some Mishnayot from a couple of various sources. But here are some pictures. And I don't know how well you can actually see me and my image, but whoops, this is not the book I'm looking for. This is the one I'm looking for. So a pretty standard translation of Mishnah is this one by a guy named Danby. And it's about 800 pages, of pretty fine print English. I think you can sort of see what's going on. So the Mishnah is not small at all. I would say the Mishnah is probably longer than a Bible. And one of the things I like to point out in the old days when I would actually teach this class in person, in this collection of 800 pages, there are 8 pages devoted, I don't know, I probably can't read it, but it says the Megillah, the scroll of Esther. So there are 8 pages devoted to the tractate Megillah, which refers to the scroll of Esther. And I just want to show you how big the Talmud is. So this is a book of Talmud with translation for just those 8 pages. And again, this has translations and commentaries and things. So it's bigger than what you would normally see in a tractate of Talmud, but there's a lot more Gemara than there is Mishnah. So I want to just read for you a few well-known Mishnahs. There's a section which many of you may have heard of called the Pirkei Avot, which means the chapters of the fathers or the sages. And this is actually about the receiving of the oral law. It says Moses received the law from Sinai and committed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and elders to the prophets, and the prophets committed it to the men of the great synagogue. They said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. If you study this carefully, you will see that the priests are left out of the chain of tradition for the Mishnah. And so what's happening here is this is the ascendancy of the rabbis and the descendancy of the priesthood. Back in the good old days when there was a temple and we worshiped God by sacrificing animals in the temple, the priests were in charge. And they controlled the sacrifice, they controlled access to God. With the destruction of the temple, a new group of Jewish leaders arises. And actually, of course, this doesn't happen the day after the temple is destroyed. Actually, there's a there's sort of a war. You could compare it to different political parties, not so different, between the world of the rabbis and the world of the priests, with the priests clinging to the idea that the only way you worship God is through animal sacrifice, and the only texts that are sacred are the written text of Torah and Bible. And now you have a new group arising, and this probably starts to form, I would guess, after the Babylonian exile. So we're talking now 500 or so BCE. You have a new group of people who are the rabbis. They're often called the Pharisees, and they are espousing a very different idea, that Moses got an oral law from Sinai, and that oral law builds in the seeds of how we are to worship God without a temple. And it's very fuzzy as to when these institutions arise. The rabbis are involved with a synagogue, which in Hebrew is a Beit Knesset, a place of meeting, rather than the temple. And we find synagogues scattered throughout the Holy Land, and indeed even through other parts of the world, of the diaspora. So what's going on here is the rabbis are grabbing authority. And they're grabbing authority by saying, we have the true interpretation of Judaism, and we're not so much involving the priesthood. We're not going to deny the idea of someday in the future there will be another temple and we'll sacrifice animals again, because that's built into the Torah, and we're not going to deny the Torah, but pretty much the priests become irrelevant with the destruction of the temple. And that's codified in the very first Mishnah of the Pirkei Avot. So I'm just going to read some other well-known Mishnayot. Joshua ben Perahiah and Nattai the Arbalite received the law from them. He said, provide yourself with a teacher and get yourself a friend. And when thou judgest any man, incline the balance in his favor. Be generous in judgment. There's a lot of stories about Hillel and Shammai. These are two rabbis that had very different opinions about most things, and they received the law. So actually, I think we're all still in the first chapter about who's getting the oral law and interpreting it. From them, Hillel said, be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving mankind and bringing them close to the law. I'll just jump down to this last one, which is very famous. He used to say, quoting Hillel here, if I am not for myself, who is for me? And being for mine own self, what am I? And if not now, when? So the Pirkei Avot is very sort of high level comments like this. Most Mishnahs are more specific. So here's a fun one that you might not be aware of. The Mishnah actually is going to analyze, remember, one of the themes of Judaism is to be very specific in understanding what is it that Jewish law, understanding what is it that God requires of me. And there's a phrase in the Bible that basically says that a husband shall not deny his wife her rights. And the Bible doesn't get very specific, but the Mishnah here is going to interpret this sexually. So this is actually from a translation. It's actually from, no, it's actually a Steinsaltz translation, not that one. So I'm just going to read a little bit because it's interesting. The Mishnah continues its discussion of a husband's obligation to cohabit with his wife. Married rabbinic students may leave their homes and go to another town for the study of the Torah without their wife's permission for periods up to 30 days, even though they will be unable to fulfill their conjugal obligation. But workers may leave to work in another town without their wife's permission for only a week at a time. Basically, what's going on, and I've threatened to have a class about Judaism and sexuality, and it's very interesting. But what's going on is sexuality is basically controlled by the woman in most of Jewish tradition, not all of Jewish tradition, but most of Jewish tradition. And now the Mishnah is going to get much more detail. The Mishnah now explains that a husband's conjugal obligation, which stems from the biblical verse, that's the one I was referring to, and her duty of marriage he shall not diminish, varies according to the husband's occupation and how frequently he is found at home. Men of leisure who spend most of their time at home are obliged to cohabit with their wives every day. Workers who work in their home town are obliged to cohabit with their wives twice a week. Ass drivers who leave their hometowns and transport merchandise to the surrounding villages, but who are ordinarily not absent from their homes for more than a week at a time. Oh, I don't know if I skipped something here. I think are obligated to have sexual relations with their wives once a week. Camel drivers who go further distances once in 30 days. Sailors going even further distances once in 6 months. And this is according to one rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer. And it's interesting, the logic of how they get to this is when they analyze the herds that are described in some of the biblical passages. There's an analysis of how many male animals and how many female animals there are in a particular herd. And it seems to be that the harder the animals work, the higher the ratio of male to female, presuming that having to work really hard diminishes your sexual energy and availability. I actually wrote a song on this Mishnah, which I may sing at the end. Bryce.
Yeah, so it strikes me as being very odd that we're specifying you must do this with your wife,
assuming she is willing.
I know, but what's bizarre is that normally in most situations it's the other way around.
Normally, in the other situations, it's the other way around.
I mean, in other words, you're telling the men you have to do this, and usually it's like, it's like it's not a chore.
Okay, we're all impressed here, especially the women, Bryce. But in fact, I mean, you should read this book I'm reading. Basically, men have the upper hand in much of Jewish law and Jewish tradition, and the Talmud is here. Jewish law and tradition here is being sensitive to a woman's rights and needs, and that's I don't know what else to say. There's also really interesting discussion beyond the scope of what I want to talk about tonight about whether eros and erotic lovemaking and passionate words and sexy outfits and fondling and kissing and the rabbinic texts get very explicit. It goes there. It's a little ambiguous in the Talmudic passages, and one of the interesting things is as the later commentators get into this, it gets more and more erotic. I'm summarizing a book I actually haven't finished reading yet. But what I find fascinating is the mystics, who you think would be really into this stuff, go the opposite direction. The mystics are going to say sex is really about reproduction, and you don't want to sort of foul your mind with dirty thoughts. So it's really, really interesting. But the mindset in this stage of Jewish law is a woman's rights have to be protected. And remember, at this stage, men can have more than one wife. So each wife has rights here. So that's
Gotcha.
probably. So here's how it's codified in Jewish law. So this is Rambam. This is the Mishnah Torah I mentioned, and the Shulchan Aruch. The conjugal obligation stated in the Torah: a husband's conjugal obligation varies according to his physical abilities and occupation, unless otherwise stipulated by the parties. Now, that's an important element, that the parties can say, husband and wife can say, it's Thursday night or Sunday morning or whatever, unless otherwise stipulated by the parties. A man of leisure is obligated to have sexual relations with his wife every day of the week. And then just what we saw before, a worker twice a week, an ass driver once a week, camel driver once a month, a sailor once every 6 days. What I'm really pointing to is the level of specificity that Jewish law is getting into. So here's the Mishnah from a tractate called Yoma. Yoma is the Aramaic word for Hayom. For those of you who know a little bit of Hebrew, it means Hayom means the day in Hebrew. Yoma means the day in Aramaic. And in the Mishnah and the Talmud, when they're talking about the day, they're talking about Yom Kippur. So the tractate Yoma is about Yom Kippur. And it is kind of interesting to see what's in here. So on the Day of Atonement, eating, drinking, washing, anointing, putting on sandals, and marital intercourse are forbidden. A king or a bride may wash their faces, and a woman after childbirth may put on sandals. So Rabbi Eliezer says it, but the sages forbid it. And if we went to the Talmud, we would see how this conflict works its way out. Now the question is, you're probably all wondering, if you're supposed to fast on Yom Kippur, you know, what if a tiny little gnat flies in your mouth? Have you violated your fast? So the rabbis are going to get very specific. If a man ate a large date's bulk, the like of it together with its stone. So the volume of solid food that you can eat and not be violating the laws of fasting on Yom Kippur is the volume of a large date. He is culpable. Any foods may be included together to make up a date's bulk. So you can't eat half a date's bulk, you know, of salami and half a date's bulk of cheese and well, you wouldn't mix meat and milk anyway, and so on. It's the total amount of volume, presumably in a day, that you can eat. Any foods may be included to make up the date's bulk, and any liquids may be included to make up the mouthful. What a man eats and what he drinks may not be included together. And it says, if he both ate and drank in a single act of forgetfulness, he's liable for one sin offering. In temple times, if you sinned, you brought an animal or something to the temple as an offering. Never mind that this is being written well after there is no temple. They're still specifying what the rules are. Let me go down. Okay, let me go down to here. They do not cause children to fast on the Day of Atonement, but they should exercise therein 1 year or 2 years before they are of age, so that they may be versed in the commandments. This also is important. If a pregnant woman smelled food and craved after it, they may give her food until she recovers herself. He that is sick may be given food at the word of skilled persons, and if no skilled persons are there, he may be given food at his own wish until he says enough. So what's going on here, and it's later codified in Jewish law, that if fasting is dangerous to your health, then by fasting you're actually violating Jewish law, and the laws as they're worked out go overboard here. So if you think it's okay for you to fast, but your doctor tells you you should not fast, then you're violating Jewish law by fasting on Yom Kippur. And by the same token, the reverse. If your doctor thinks you can fast, but you feel like you can't get through it, then you're also exempt from fasting. I give this talk every Yom Kippur to make sure that people aren't threatening their health by fasting. This is kind of interesting. Again, they're still talking about fasting, but we're going to get into Sabbath rules. If a ravenous hunger seized a man, he may be given even unclean things until his eyes are enlightened. And there's lots of footnotes here which give you details as to what they're talking about. So what that means is, if you're starving, presumably on Yom Kippur, but certainly not on Yom Kippur, and the only food you have available to you is not kosher, you're permitted to eat non-kosher food. This one doesn't make sense, I think medically, although we have an experienced veterinarian here who can comment on this. If a mad dog bit him, he may not be given the lobe of its liver to eat, but Rabbi Matityahu ben Chersh permits it. Presumably there was a thought that eating the lobe of the liver of a mad dog would cure you of rabies. I'm pretty sure that's not true. Is that right, Les?
No,
okay.
I don't think so, no.
But anyway, that was going too far for the rabbis, at least some of the rabbis. If a man has a pain in his throat, they may drop medicine into his mouth on the Sabbath, since there is doubt whether his life is in danger, and whether there is doubt whether his life is in danger overrides the Sabbath. So presumably measuring out medicine would not be allowed on the Sabbath, but if it's a matter of health, it is. This is actually a very famous and important Mishnah. If a building fell down on a man and there is doubt whether he is there or not, or whether he is alive or dead, or whether he is a Gentile or an Israelite, they may clear away the ruin from above him. If they find him alive, they may clear it away still more from above him. But if dead, they leave him. So building falls on somebody, you're allowed to search for him. You've probably heard the term pikuach nefesh, which is understood to mean to save a life, but pikuach means to search for or uncover. And this is where it comes from. But presumably, if you're searching through the rubble on the Sabbath and you find someone's dead, you don't excavate them until the Sabbath is over. Another important Mishnah about Yom Kippur. If a man says, I will sin and repent, he will given no chance to repent. If he says, I will sin and the Day of Atonement will affect atonement, then the Day of Atonement affects no atonement. In other words, if he's insincere or she's insincere, then these systems of atonement and forgiveness of sin don't work. And this is the one we talk about all the time. For transgressions that are between a man and God, the Day of Atonement affects atonement. But for transgressions that are between a man and his fellow, the Day of Atonement affects atonement only if he has appeased his fellow. Understood to mean only if you ask for and receive forgiveness. So that's Mishnah. Any questions on Mishnah? And understand, people spend their lives studying Mishnah, so we're not going to resolve it at the moment. I have a set of Mishnahs with a lot of commentary, and it's 21 volumes. They're not big volumes, but they're still 21 volumes. So it's just a lot of material. Okay, so we finished Mishnah. Now we're on to Talmud. Talmud is extraordinarily difficult. It's difficult for a lot of reasons. For one thing, as you'll see, it's written in Aramaic. There's no punctuation. It's lengthy. And intellectually and logically, it's very difficult. And for those of you who have, shown up for Talmud study, either we have a group at Temple of Dad Elohim in Thousand Oaks, and I know several of you actually come to this on Saturday mornings, 8 o'clock Pacific time. I'll be happy to send you links if you would like to participate in Talmud, which is then followed by Torah study. The Talmud is difficult to just follow the logic, and the logic is tortured, and the language is difficult. And the rabbis, according to my teacher, Judith Abrams, made this deliberately so. They wanted us to study with others. They did not want us to just sit down and read the text on our own. And I think I mentioned, I think it was Saturday morning, maybe in a different class, when Rabbi Steinsaltz, who just recently died, prepared first a translation of the Talmud into Hebrew. So he did a couple of things. He took the Aramaic text and put vowels and punctuation in it. He translated the Aramaic into Hebrew. This is for clearly Hebrew speakers and Israelis and others. And then provided explanations in the text. It was very controversial in the Jewish world, and he was severely criticized in the scholarly Jewish world because people thought that meant you could just have one of his books and study by yourself. And they thought that was violating an important spirit of Jewish study. The other reason it's complicated is the rabbis wanted to teach us more than just what their decisions are. They wanted to teach us how they came up with their decisions. So if you study a bunch of Talmud, you will see there's long and tortured logic, and sometimes they'll have a long discussion and they'll say, no, we're not going to do this. And they'll come back and then they'll go down a different path and they'll say, no, we're not going to do that. Then they'll come back to the question, and they'll go down to a third path, and I say, yes, this is what the rabbis conclude. So the question we're wondering here is, why did they drag us through all this material that we've been studying for weeks and weeks? And the answer is they wanted us to learn how they think. They knew that if they wrote a code of law, we're going to study codes of law, they knew that if they wrote a code of law, the code of law would be obsolete very quickly. But what they wanted to do was teach a process to rabbis of the future who, when presented with problems that could never be anticipated, such as electricity and computers and travel between time zones, never contemplated in Talmudic times, they would make the same decisions in our day that these rabbis would make if they were around today. That's the process that's going on. So as I mentioned, the commentary on Mishnah is called Gemara, and it comes from the Hebrew word for completion. It's written in Hebrew and Aramaic. It does not address each of the 63 tractates. That one Pirkei Avot that has these wonderful terse statements does not have any Gemara. The Babylonian Talmud has 37 tractates, and the Jerusalem Talmud has 39, and they're not the same ones. And some Talmudic material may have been lost over the years. There's very famous episodes of Talmud burning in the 10th or 11th century. And my simplified way of understanding this is, I think the continuation of Judaism just plain mystified the church and Christian authority for hundreds of years. Because by and large, the Christian church was only familiar with what they would call the Old Testament. And if you read the Old Testament, the way the Jews are supposed to be worshiping are sacrificing animals at the temple, but there's no temple. So what in the world are the Jews doing? Turns out there's not so many of them that it's not a big worry, but my guess is it just mystified the church. I think as early as maybe the 700s, there starts to be disputations between typically Jews who have converted to Christianity and Christian. And in these disputations, the Christians become aware that at the heart of Judaism is the Talmud. And so we have enormous cases of Talmud burnings. And remember, these are all handwritten documents. And so we think it may well be that entire tractates are lost. It also may well be that elements of the Talmud get edited so as not to cause trouble. There's a very interesting discussion of what does the Talmud say about Jesus. And the answer is, in the copies of the Talmud that we have, almost nothing. So we have no recorded Mishnah or Gemara on this subject. But what we do have are commentaries that have survived, other books. And by reading the commentaries, we can backtrack into what the Talmud might have been saying about this new religion, Christianity. And let's just say it isn't favorable. And so the Christian church would not have been very happy. And probably as rabbis continued to make copies of Talmud, either these sections were lost or they were deliberately edited out for the sake of peace. The Talmud contains, this is important, both halachic, the word halacha means law, Jewish law, and agadic. Agadic is folkloric material, stories. The book that we read on Passover is called the Haggadah, which is the same word because same root, because it tells the story of Passover. So there's material in the Talmud and the Bible, for that matter, which is both legal and sort of ethical and folk stories. And that's really interesting because if you look at other sources of sacred material, they tend to be strictly legal, or they tend to have folk stories, but you don't find a mix. So the mixing is interesting. The Talmud is first printed in Venice in 1520, which is very shortly after the invention of movable type. And every Talmud printed since this date has the exact same layout. So rather than, when we quote a verse from, let's say, the Bible, I might say Genesis 1:26, first chapter of Genesis, the 26th verse. In Talmud, as you'll see in a moment, the way we quote it is based on page number, because every page since 1520 is identical. So, for example, if you would see a reference to the Talmud, Shabbat 4a, it means the A side of the page. Every page has an A side and a B side, and a fourth page. We'll see the organization of a Talmud page. It is complex, and it reads like stream of consciousness discussion of Mishnah. Those of you who study this know this. They'll be talking about a particular interesting point of contention. And then they'll say, you know, well, Rabbi A says this and Rabbi B says that. Oh, while we're talking about Rabbi A and B, let's look at 10 other things that they discussed together, which have nothing to do with the discussion that we've just been going on. And so for a couple of pages, we're going to have more discussions of Rabbi A, typically Hillel and Shammai, arguing with each other. And it seems like stream of conscious, but it's very carefully edited. And as I say, most often the most interesting points are made during this wandering. I should also say that in traditional rabbinic training, the lion's share of the training is in Talmud. That's what the rabbis do day in and day out, study Talmud. There's an enormous amount of effort in the conservative seminaries on Talmud, and far less in the Reform seminaries. I think we may have spent like 2 years with sort of one class each semester on Aramaic, just learning to read and understand Aramaic, Mishnah and Talmud. Whereas in a conservative seminary, it would be far more than that. So this is the way a page of Talmud looks. So I think I'm gonna be able to zoom in on this. Now I've discovered a new trick in the second page here of my second screen. So here's a page of Talmud. Broadly speaking, what's going on is the Mishnah and the Gemara are in the center of the page. And here, as we'll see when I zoom in on this, this is Mishnah and this is Gemara, and the Gemara may go on for another 4 or 5, 10 pages like this before we get to the next Mishnah. And then there's lots of commentaries going on in the margins. So I'm going to see if I can zoom in. Okay. Okay. So at the very top of the page, it says here, and I know, you know, not all of you are Hebrew readers. This says Perek Rishon, the first section, Pesachim. So the name of the tractate here is Passover. So if you just grab a Talmud and you know where to look, you can tell on any page, or if you see a copy of a page of Talmud, what tractate it's in. And then this is a section which describes the first words of the chapter. So, or lo baya eser, and I'm not sure what they're referring to there, but that's the section, the title of the chapter. And now we're going to have all kinds of really interesting little notes in the margins. So this is the page number. So this is page bet. It means it's the second page. Every section of Talmud begins with page number 2, and you can't see it, but there's no dot here. If there was, I think, 1 or 2 dots, I can't remember now, it would be the B side of the page. So this is the A side of the page. And now we're going to have Jewish legal codes. So here's one called Ein Mishpat. So something's coming up and a Jewish legal authority wants to make a comment. And then here, I'm just going to go around the page. Here's the commentary of Rabbeinu Hanalel, 990 to 1050. This whole section is called Tosafot, very important, 1100 to 1300. This section, as I pointed out, is the Gemara, and you probably can't see it. I don't know if I can get it. No, it doesn't look like I can get it any further. But there's a slightly larger print. There's a gimel, a mem, and a little apostrophe that tells you where the Gemara begins. So all the rest of this is Gemara. Notice there's no punctuation. There's no capitalization. Here's another rabbi Joel somebody, and here's another rabbi. Oh, this is later. So the basic page of Mishnah and Gemara and the main commentaries never change, but here's somebody from the 1700s. So clearly that has changed since 1500. This is very important, this page, this side of the page, because this is the commentary of Rashi. And you probably can't see it, but it's written in its own funky italics form, which is called Rashi script. Rashi script, I would say roughly half of the letters look nothing like their Hebrew equivalent. So one of the fun things about rabbinical school is learning to read Rashi script. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Whoops. About a page of Talmud. Now, for those of you that don't want to struggle with the original, and I actually should show you this, here is, if you're going on a trip and you want to bring along your Talmud, this is strictly for show and tell. This is actually several tractates. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different tractates, and it's pretty fine print. Oh, are you taking a picture? Yeah, I'm going to show Safari in a moment. And these are the regular pages. You can kind of see, I hope, that the pages all look like what I have just showed you. And then there are some commentaries that don't make it onto the big page, on the main pages. And these are even in finer print. I would say we're almost in the world of microfiche here. But you can bring this along on the train, presumably with super good reading glasses, and study. So for those of you who want to find good translations and commentaries, there is a wonderful resource which is free and astoundingly broad and complex. Well, I'd say not necessarily complex, but complete. You'll find commentaries by 10 or 12 commentaries on every section of Torah. And for Talmud, so here is the beginning of the tractate about blessings called Berachot. And the text is pointed, which is to say it has vowels and dots and even punctuation. There is a question mark and a little commentary here. And I don't know how well you can see this, but the bold print is what the Mishnah is actually saying. And then in the other print, the commentator, I'm not sure which, is a William Davidson Talmud. I'm not sure who the commentary is by, is helping us. So if I would just to read the bold print, it says, from when Shema in the evening, from the time the priest entered to partake of their terumah, until the end of the first watch. That is a statement of Rabbi Eliezer. So it's pretty terse, even if you understand the Aramaic words. So this commentary, which is similar to modern commentaries, are going to help us understand it. It'll say from when, that is, from what time does one recite the Shema in the morning, in the evening, I'm sorry. You're supposed to say the Shema in the morning, in the evening. So clearly there must be a time limit. So the Mishnah is going to refer to that. And it goes back to what the priests would do and when they would eat their offerings. Oops. Oh. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to go on. And then this is just the Mishnah. And then the Gemara is going to take over at section 2, I believe. Maybe not. No, I think that's still Mishnah. Okay, so just to show you some more pictures, this is a complete set of Talmud. So this would look, all the pages would look very much like these pages, no English, no translation. And so the 63 tractates of the, well, in the Bavli, there's less than 63 tractates. So this says Talmud Bavli. And then here you can see the different tractates are listed. So it's not small. I often refer to the Talmud as our New Testament. And I think it fulfills a similar role as a Christian New Testament. Christian New Testament is explaining the Hebrew Bible through the lens of Christian understanding, the church fathers and other sacred material. The Talmud is explaining the Hebrew Bible through the lens of the rabbis and other sacred material, namely the oral law. but it's much, much more complex and much more lengthy than a New Testament. And I've often worked with people who, on hearing the Talmud, say, yeah, I'm going to buy me a Talmud and read it. It sounds like it should be really interesting. I don't recommend trying. Unfortunately, now you can go to Sefaria and start studying. And there is a program called Daf Yomi. What is Daf Yomi? Daf Yomi means reading 1 page a day of Talmud. So what is a page? It is the A side and the B side of a Talmud. And everywhere in the world, people who have subscribed to Daf Yomi are reading the same page. So you can go online and see commentaries and explanations of that particular page. And it takes 7 years reading a page a day. And that's actually a lot of material. It takes 7 years to get through the Talmud reading with the discipline of a page a day. So I'm pretty sure I went through this when we talked about Torah, but I'll just refresh your memory as to what's in the Bible, what's in the Mishnah, and what's in the Gemara concerning, a pretty well-known commandment, namely to rest on the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. There is a commandment I always point out to work on 6 days, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of Hashem, of the Lord, Adonai, thy God. In it, you will not do any work, not you, nor your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, the cattle, the stranger that is in thy gates. So the problem, of course, is how do you define work? And I don't remember if we went through this exercise, but I'll just ask, how would some of you define work for yourself? You can unmute yourself and chime in. And remembering this is in the Bible a capital offense, so it's pretty important to know, there's a couple of highly publicized crimes here in the news these days, and you want to be very careful about the definition. So how would you define work? Nobody's going to chime in. Okay, well, people will often say something that you get paid for, and I always point out that rabbis get paid to work, to lead services on the Sabbath, so that can't be work. People will say things you don't like to do, and the one I always go to is it work to change a baby's diaper? And most people will say, yes, it's work. And so if our sacred literature defined that as work, the baby would be, the technical term in Aramaic is verstunkt, for the entire Sabbath, meaning smelly. So you're not going to do that. So it's not only how do you define work, but more importantly, how does God define work? And you would think that if God went to the trouble to tell us to do no work, now I'm using the English word work, but the Hebrew word is malacha, on the Sabbath, that somewhere God would have defined it. And sure enough, in the Mishnah, there is a description of the major categories of work. And it says there are 40 less 1, namely 39. And there's a list. And I always point out a few of them, writing 2 letters, and they don't mean one to mom and one to dad. They mean an aleph and a bet. Extinguishing a fire, kindling a fire, carrying things from one domain into another. These are the 49 labors. And then, as you can imagine, the Talmud is going to dive into each one of these, the Gemara, to spell it out and tease it out. And then these are sort of descriptive of agricultural times. As life goes on and we start living in cities and electricity is invented, we need to continue to develop Jewish law on these subjects. So that's where this idea of responsa literature comes in. A question will arise. It will be sent to a rabbinic legal authority, and that authority will hand down a decision. And if and I say he because in ancient times would always be a guy, if he's well respected, his decision would be respected. In the world of conservative Judaism, there is a law committee. And in the world Reform Judaism, there is a responsa committee, and questions continue to arise, and the people on the committees make the decisions for purposes of Jews wondering about them. And there are always responsa literature I find really interesting because it's always actual cases. Typically, a responsum deals with a very specific occurrence. I'll give you an example that's not so controversial or troubling. So a synagogue is building a new building. The old building's getting tired and they're going to put up a new building. And the people that are working on the building are not necessarily Jewish. So is it a violation of Jewish law that they work on the Sabbath? Okay, that's a question. Yes. And so the answer gets into the degree of control over which the synagogue has over their labor. So the answer, and I'm pretty sure this is a reform responsum, the answer is, if the contract works as follows: build me a building and get it done 2 years from now, and you're on your own, then the synagogue has no control over the workers. They're working on the Sabbath, doesn't violate the Jewish law. Remember, the text said your servants can't work on the Sabbath. But if the synagogue has a committee, let's say, that is serving as the general contractor and has day-to-day or more immediate control over when the workers work, then it is a violation of Jewish law to assign specific tasks to a worker on the Sabbath. That's an example of a responsa and a reform responsa. Looking at the Gemara is interesting. So the Gemara is going to question everything. So the first thing they question isn't one you might think is worthy of in-depth analysis. The Gemara, the text says 40 less 1. So the Gemara is going to first ask a question. This happens all the time. The Gemara asks a question and then says that's a stupid question, or it refutes it, or they argue about it. So this is a very common way of Gemara starting. It says, why state the number? The underlying assumption is, if we were really curious about how many things are in this list, we could count them, right? So the underlying assumption is everything in sacred literature, and Mishnah traditionally is understood to have been given by God to Moses on Sinai, everything is significant. So the fact that the number is specifically called out and stated has some significance. Now the question is, what's the significance? So Rabbi Yochanan says, to teach that if one performs them all in one state of unawareness, he is liable on account of each separately. What does that mean? The example I always use is the following. You've been ill, and you really have been out of it, running a high fever. You're not even sure what day it is. You wake up one morning and you're feeling a little better. And so you stumble your way into the bathroom, and you turn on the light and you look at yourself. And if you're a guy, you realize, my God, I haven't shaved in 4 or 5 days. So I take out my electric razor and I start shaving with my electric razor. And then I turn on the radio and I realize it's Saturday. So the question is, have I committed one sin, that of forgetting that it's Saturday, or have I committed 3 sins, each occurrence individually? And what the Gemara is saying is that you're liable on account of each separately. Now, these days, that might be a distinction without a difference, because presumably you would ask God for forgiveness for the inadvertent sin of violating the Sabbath. But in temple times, you'd have to bring 3 sin offerings. So that's typical of the kind of material you will find in Gemara. So I want to close my discussion of Talmud. If I'll give you a few books that I'll talk about with my favorite story. And although I have it up, let me read it. We have time. So this is a story of the oven of Achnai. And in the world of rabbis, if you say the oven of Achnai, they will know what you're talking about. And Let me describe it rather than read it, because the text is really pretty hard to read. So what's going on here is the rabbis are having an argument about whether a particular oven is kosher. And what they mean by that is, can it convey uncleanliness? And it's a technical issue. If an object is whole, like a whole pitcher, if it's made unclean, anything you put in the object will be unclean. If it's broken or in pieces, it can't convey uncleanliness from one thing to another. Don't ask me why, I don't know. But that's the argument. They're having an argument about a certain kind of oven. What kind of oven is this? It's kind of a camping oven. It's portable. So instead of having just like a beehive, imagine, pizza oven, a beehive that's one unit. This is an oven that's cut into sections, so it's easier to cart around. And the rabbis are having an argument about whether the oven falls into category A or category B. And Rabbi Eliezer brought forth every imaginable argument, but the other rabbis, didn't accept his arguments. So Rabbi Eliezer is getting pretty frustrated here. And he says, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place. Others affirm 400 cubits. What they mean is the tree got up and started walking. Now, I don't know about you, but that would have convinced me, but not the rabbis. The rabbis say no proof can be brought from a carob tree. So Eliezer says, if the halacha agrees with me, let this stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream starts flowing backwards. No proof can be brought from a stream of water, they rejoin. He says, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove it. They're sitting in a Beit Midrash. It's called the schoolhouse here, but it's a house of study. And whereupon the walls started caving in. But Rabbi Joshua, who's the head of this group, admonishes the wall, rebukes the walls, saying, if scholars are engaged in a halakhic dispute, who asked you? What right do you have to interfere? So they didn't continue to fall in honor of Rabbi Joshua, nor did they go back upright in honor of Rabbi Eliezer. And you can only imagine that the story is invented when you have a bunch of scholars in a Beit Midrash, as a study hall, where the walls have partially collapsed. And they said, oh, here's where it happened. So here's the best part. Again, he says, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. Whereupon a heavenly voice cries out, God's voice cries out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him? So picture this. God shows up and says to this group of rabbis, Eliezer on this side has got the winning argument. The rest of you guys are wrong. So the response of the rabbis is not what you might guess. Rabbi Joshua arose and exclaimed, Lo b'shamayim hi. It's not in heaven. That's actually quoting a phrase from Deuteronomy that we read on Yom Kippur about the fact that the Torah isn't so far away. It's not in the heavens. It's completely quoting out of context. What this rabbi is saying, let's see what the Gemara says. What did he mean by this? Said Rabbi Jeremiah, that the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice because thou, you God, have long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority, one must incline. So what's going on here is the rabbis are going to ignore God's input because Scripture's done. God, you had your shot. Now it's up to the rabbis to make law. Who asked you? So not only does God not get to make a decision, he doesn't even get counted. He's recorded present, not abstaining, but he doesn't even get a vote. So even the more interesting part of this is later on, Rabbi Natan meets Elijah. Elijah is always showing up. That's another one thing I want to teach about, is a series on Elijah. Elijah's very, very interesting character. You remember Elijah maybe you don't remember. Elijah is a prophet. I guess like 6, 7, 800 BCE. I can't remember the exact time frame. And Elijah is one of 2 people in the Bible who is said didn't die. Elijah ascends to the heavens in a fiery chariot. It doesn't say he died and was gathered to his kin and so on. So Elijah is always quoted in Jewish mysticism and Jewish thought as someone who has a connection to the heavens. The tradition is Elijah will bring in the Messiah. Elijah, if he shows up on Passover night, will bring the Messiah into your Seder, who will tell us whether we should drink that 5th cup of wine. So Rabbi Natan, he lived several hundred years after this argument, meets Elijah and asks him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do when in that hour? What was God's response when we told him, basically, it's none of your business? Elijah reports that God laughed with joy, saying, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. So what's going on here, I think, is a very profound point. Namely, every religion has to close its scripture, because to leave the possibility that somebody could come up with new scripture from God threatens the structure of the religion. The only religion I know of that actually still has prophets is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes called the Mormons. Their top guy is called a prophet, and I am told by Mormon friends that he can actually issue rulings which have the status of prophecy in other religions. But in our world, it is no longer up to God. And very importantly, even if you hear God speaking to you and telling you to do something, if doing that thing violates Jewish law, God doesn't get a vote. I often think about this. You know, it was quite a few years ago that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jew who believed that he was giving away too much land and rights to the Palestinians. So, you know, he believed that God was basically telling him to kill Rabin. So what this bit of Talmud would say is, even if everybody agrees that God is saying this, we still ignore God. And one of my teachers that I quote often, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, talks about 3 eras of Jewish law and authority. And the way he divides it is from the beginning up until the destruction of the temple, God's in charge. The rabbis, as we get into the Mishnah and so on, the rabbis have some role, but basically God makes the rules. With the destruction of the temple, God and the rabbis have a role in sort of a division of labor in authority. He argues, Yitz Greenberg does, that with the Shoah, that now it's the people who have the authority rather than the rabbis over Jewish law. And ultimately what the Jewish people insist upon is what will actually happen in the world. That's his thesis. So I'll recommend a few books and then ask if there are questions. A wonderful scholar of Talmud of blessed memory is Rabbi Judith Abrams of Texas, by the way. We have a couple of Texans in the group. And she's written a bunch of good books, all published. Well, Jason Aronson is not publishing anymore. I'm not sure how many of these are in print. One is called Learn Talmud. This one is really only useful if you have a Steinsaltz Torah, Steinsaltz Talmud. But she's written several volumes called The Talmud for Beginners. 3 volumes, one on prayer, one on text, and one on living in a non-Jewish world. She's written a book called The Complete Idiots. The Women of the Talmud, and another author has written a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Talmud. And I'm embarrassed to say that this is actually a pretty good introduction to the Talmud. And then there are lots of collections of Talmudic sayings. There's one by Cohen, Every Man's Talmud, a Talmudic anthology, and we read the story of the oven of Achnai. I have sent out an email, I think, to all of you with reading suggestions for future classes. So for the next class, I think the next class is on Midrash Halacha, Jewish legal codes and issues. And importantly, there is no class next week at all. Wednesday night is just before Thanksgiving. Many people are traveling. And of course, so we will not have a class on that Wednesday night. I will be sending you, I'm going to be teaching, this is just coming together rather rapidly. I'm going to be teaching 6 teachings on 6 nights of Hanukkah. Not the first 6 nights, because I won't do this on Friday night. There's a program called Shining a Light on Anti-Semitism, which is being observed around the country. And our contribution at the local Jewish Federation is to have short teachings on anti-Semitism's origins, explanations, and I'm going to be showing some pretty good professionally made videos and then leading a discussion, and you will all get emails from me on that subject. So I'm going to stop the sharing and ask if you have questions or comments. Okay, hearing none, I'm going to do my song for you, and I don't have it printed out in front of me, so hopefully I'll remember it. There's a couple of things you should know. One of the teachings with Rabbi Abrams, I studied Talmud with her, and she gave a beautiful little teaching about sexual relations. It was in the context of that Mishnah that we learned. And she told a story, the Gemara tells a story about a woman who is married to a Torah student. The Torah students have an obligation, I think it was once a month, but like members of Congress, they often exempted themselves from their obligations. So there was a woman who was married to a Torah scholar, and he went away, far away, to study. And of course, he couldn't get home regularly. And this guy was so committed that he only came home once a year. What day did he come home? For one night only, Erev Yom Kippur, when of course they couldn't have sexual relations. So nevertheless, she still loves him and adores him. And on Erev Yom Kippur, as the sun is setting, she's on her porch, looking for him and hoping to see him coming. And then he gets so wrapped up in his studies that he forgets that the sun is setting on Erev Yom Kippur, on the day before Yom Kippur. And when he looks up, he doesn't have time to get home. And so he can't get home. And when she realizes that she won't see him even for this one day, she sheds a tear. And there's a lot of discussion about the power of tears in Judaism. And when she sheds a tear, that the study hall collapses and kills this guy. So it struck me hearing about this. One other thing you should know, this is from Jewish mysticism, from Kabbalah, the idea that it is a double mitzvah. It is a particular mitzvah to make love on Friday night. Okay? And there's all sorts of interesting mystical reasons for this. It has to do with combining God's male and female aspects. And if this shocks or interests you, I encourage you to look into some of my classes on Kabbalah, but I'll be talking about this when we get to our session on Kabbalah. And so just like by couples joining, and let's face it, we're talking in the Talmud about heterosexual couples. By couples joining on Erev Shabbat, we are encouraging God's male and female aspects to join. So all this, particularly that story about the house collapsing, struck me that it sounded like a country western tune. Doesn't that sound like a country western story? So I thought I ought to write one. So here is my version of this story. The references to Talmud Bavel, which we've just been reading, to the tune of Achy Breaky Heart. You can study Torah, be happy, dance a hora, meditate and daven left and right, but come home once a week. Come back now, don't be meek, because it's a double mitzvah Friday night. Double mitzvah Friday night. By me, you're out of sight. Come home now, don't you know the halacha? Yeah, don't break the law. the Talmud Torah law, or I'll have to revoke your bar mitzvah. If you drove an ass, you might not have much class, but at least I'd have you once a week. And if you drove a camel, according to Talmud Bavel, once in a new moon we'd hide and seek. But you're worse than a sailor, a twice-a-year failure. You never come home anymore. Although I'm always willing, you only late to fill in. And that's no mitzvah Friday night. Double mitzvah Friday night. By me, you're out of sight. Come home now, don't you know the halacha? Yeah, don't break the law, the Talmud Torah law, or I'll have to revoke your bar mitzvah.
Yay.
Thank you. And I didn't want to give it away, but the word for putting on these straps of tefillin in Hebrew is lahaniach tefillin, which means to lay tefillin. You're laying the straps on your arms. And I will say one of my proudest books back there is a book by Rabbi Abrams, because I actually wrote this while she was teaching. Part of my brain was going off into space on this. And so I did it at the conclusion of the class. And her inscription to me on her book is, she described me as her achy breaky Talmud guy. So let me call on Larry. Larry, go ahead.
Okay, this is a story, comical story, about that very thing, about making love on Shabbat. So this guy goes to his wife. He comes back from the synagogue and he says, "It's Sabbath night." And she says, "Look, we got to quit that, because it's not right that we're not supposed to work on Shabbat. And me having sex or me making love with you is work." So the guy gets kind of confused. And after Shabbat, he goes over to the rabbi and he says, "Rabbi," he says, "is making love on Shabbat, is that really work like my wife says?" And he says, "I don't know." He says, "Drop back by here when you come back from lunch." So the guy comes back by and the rabbi says, "Yes, I've thought about it. And if making love on Shabbat was work, my wife would have the maid do it."
Right. He says it's definitely not work. Yep. I thought of that joke too, Larry, but I didn't have the courage to say it. Now that I'm a rabbi.
I'm no rabbi, so
yes.
you know.
Yeah. I've had to, some of you may not believe it, but I've actually had to constrain myself with the, now that I wear the kippah, where I wear the hat. Okay, any other questions or comments? If not, I will see you in a week, and actually the week after.
Not
Yes,
this
go ahead.
Not next week.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, yes, 2 weeks, sorry, yes. I mean, we'll skip a week and it will be in Hanukkah. So I'll send out a note on these teachings on anti-Semitism, and as in the past, I'll be recording them, so you'll be able to watch them even if you have other things going on. And what I will probably do is that week, which will be like December 1st, I will probably have us meet, with my apologies to the East Coast, beginning at 8 o'clock rather than 7 o'clock. And as always, YouTube. So if it's just too late to stay up, and apologies to other time zones, but I can't do two things at once. So have a good evening, everyone, and I'm gonna stop the recording.